The first cut of the evening was delivered so gently that a stranger might have mistaken it for kindness, but Alara Ashford heard every word of it, and heard, too, the small, appreciative laugh that followed, the kind of laugh a room gives permission to. She did not turn. She did not lower her eyes to the parquet as though searching for an excuse to leave it. She did not give the drawing room the satisfaction of watching color rise in her face, though it rose anyway, hot and private, beneath skin that had long since learned to keep its own counsel. Alderley House, in the third autumn of her marriage, had developed a particular talent for falling quiet at exactly the moment it ought to have spoken up. A stillness that had nothing to do with manners, and everything to do with an audience deciding, collectively and without a word passing between them, whose feelings were worth protecting and whose were not. The room itself seemed built for that arithmetic. Portraits of duchesses long dead looked down from walls the color of good claret, their painted eyes following the candlelight rather than the living, and the chairs nearest the fire had been arranged, by long habit rather than any spoken rule, so that the family sat close to the warmth and the family's more recent additions sat near enough to feel the cold coming off the windows. Alara had learned to call the word they used for her practical, and to hear it now, the way one hears a bell that has been rung too many times to still sound like music. Practical. It was the word Aunt Honoria had used the day the settlement was signed. Practical, meaning affordable, meaning convenient, meaning here was a girl with no fortune and no great beauty to speak of, but a level head and a willingness to be grateful. And it was the word Lady Cressida Marsh used now, murmuring it to the woman beside her, with the particular warmth people reserve for insults they intend to be quoted. How practical of the Duke, to marry a girl who would never expect flowers. Under the lace at her wrist, hidden by a glove gone soft with age at the seams, Alara's fingers found the small hard shape she carried everywhere, a plain silver thimble, worn thin at the crown, dented in one place where a hand not her own had dropped it on a stone floor 40 years before, and she pressed her thumb to it the way another woman might have touched a locket full of a lover's hair. Around her, throats glittered with sapphires she had never been given and had never once allowed herself to want aloud. And skirts the color of hothouse flowers moved past her plain gray silk like water parting around a stone that had simply, stubbornly, refused to be washed downstream. No one saw her steady Lady Pharaoh's trembling elbow when the old woman missed her footing near the hearth. No one saw the swift economical motion with which she caught a toppling candle before it could catch the hem of a child too young to be awake at that hour. And no one thanked her for either. Because thanks require first that a thing be seen. And she had long ago stopped expecting to be seen doing anything at all. The orchestra did not falter. The candles burned on, indifferent as ever to who suffered beneath them. The evening simply continued, as evenings do, folding the small private ruin of one woman into itself without a ripple. And somewhere across the room her husband's mother, the Dowager Duchess of Alderley, sat as she always sat, upright as a closed door, and did not rise. She had not risen for anyone in 30 years. It was said of her the way other things were said of mountains, as a fact of geography rather than a matter of choice, and no one under that roof, not even Alara, had ever seen it proven false. Alara had come to Alderley House the way a great many practical arrangements come to pass, quietly, efficiently, and with almost no reference to what either party might privately have wished. Her father had been a gentleman in the thinning, apologetic way that word acquires when the money behind it has long since gone, and her mother, before illness took her in the wet spring of Alara's 15th year, had earned the family's actual bread with a needle, taking in fine mending for houses far grander than her own, houses whose mistresses would not have received her at their tables, but were glad enough to receive the work of her hands. It was her mother who had pressed the thimble into Alara's palm on one of the last clear afternoons of her life, folding her daughter's fingers shut around it with a grip already going thin, and said, in the flat, unsentimental voice she used for truths she meant to be obeyed rather than admired, "A good seam, mended with care, holds stronger than the cloth around it. Do you understand me, Alara? Stronger, not weaker. Remember that when they tell you that what has been torn is worth less for the tearing." She had not understood it then. She had understood the smell of her mother's hands well enough, wool and beeswax and the particular clean sharpness of steel needles kept always oiled, and she had understood the sound of her mother humming over a hoop of linen on winter evenings, low and tuneless and entirely content, but the meaning of the words themselves had taken years to settle, arriving in fragments the way truths given too early to a child always do, a little more revealed each time life tore something and asked her to mend it. Her father had died 2 winters later, quietly, of nothing so dramatic as grief, though everyone agreed privately that it looked a great deal like it, and Alara had gone, at 17, to live under the roof of her aunt Honoria Winslow, a woman who loved her the way one loves a useful tool, sincerely and without the smallest curiosity about what the tool might have preferred to be. It was Aunt Honoria who had first heard, through the elaborate underground telegraph by which such things traveled among women who had nothing else to trade in, that the young Duke of Alderley required a wife of good enough blood and low enough profile to settle a matter of inheritance that need not be repeated in company. A technical difficulty involving an entailment and a dead cousin, and a great deal of family pride that could be resolved neatly by a marriage contracted with speed and without sentiment. Aunt Honoria had called it Providence. She had called it, more than once and always within Alara's hearing, our clever girl's great good fortune, and she had gone on calling it that for 3 years now, in letters that arrived with impressive regularity whenever her own household required funds that a niece married to a duke might reasonably be expected to supply. The marriage itself had been conducted with the brisk courtesy of a property transfer. Julian Ashford, Duke of Alderley, had met his bride 4 times before the wedding and spoken to her, by Alara's own private and exact count, for a total of perhaps 40 minutes, all of it correct, none of it warm, and she had gone to the altar telling herself, with the particular discipline of a woman who has trained her own hopes the way one trains a garden, that correctness would be enough, that she required nothing further, that a good arrangement kept honestly was worth more than a bad romance kept badly. It was not until the 2nd month of her marriage that she overheard, through a door left carelessly ajar off the estate office, the sentence that would sit at the bottom of her like a stone dropped into still water, sending its rings outward for years afterward. She had gone that afternoon to bring her husband a matter concerning the tenant cottages at Hollow Ash, 3 families sharing a roof that leaked in a way the steward had called minor, and Alara, who had walked the lane herself in the rain to see it, knew to be considerably worse than minor, and she had raised her hand to knock and heard, instead, her husband's voice, low and even, addressing his mother in the tone he used for matters he considered settled. "It answers the difficulty with the entailment, that is all it need do," he had said. "I felt nothing when I married her, and I expect to feel nothing further. It is a contract well executed, mother, nothing more, and I would thank you not to look at me as though I have done something cruel in wanting it kept that way." She had not knocked. She had stood in the cold corridor with her hand still raised, and she had listened to her own heartbeat instead of to whatever the Dowager said in reply, because the words had already done what such words are built to do, arriving with the particular finality of a door closing somewhere just out of sight, and she had withdrawn along the passage without a sound. Her half-formed request about the leaking roof folded back into her chest, along with everything else she had learned, in 3 years, to carry without setting down. She told no one. She did not even, in the strict accounting she kept with herself in the dark hours before sleep, allow the sentence its full weight, choosing instead to file it under things already known, things that required no fresh grief, because the grief had, in truth, been paid in advance, in installments, since the day the settlement was signed. It was, perhaps, this very economy of feeling that made the public death of that autumn evening land as hard as it did, for a wound expected is not always a wound blunted, and there is a particular cruelty in being humiliated for the very quality one has cultivated as protection. The occasion was the annual autumn assembly at Alderley House, the first great gathering of the season, at which the family's tenants' improvement fund was traditionally announced with as much ceremony as the family could be persuaded to spare for people who did not, strictly, dine at their table. It had been Alara's own quiet labor, conducted over 11 months without a single public word taken for it, that had turned hollow ash from 3 leaking cottages into a fund substantial enough to re-roof the entire row and dig a proper well besides, money coaxed from 3 separate reluctant tenants of the estate's own timber rights. A scheme drafted at her writing desk, in a hand she had disguised as her husband's steward's, so that no one need know a duchess had spent her mornings doing sums that smelled of tar and rainwater rather than embroidery. She had wanted no credit for it. She had told herself, quite honestly, that the roofs mattered more than the recognition. And this had been true right up until the moment Lady Seraphina Vale rose at the assembly, resplendent in a gown the deep saturated green of a rival faction's colors, and accepted, with exquisitely modest reluctance, the steward's public thanks for what he called, with an apologetic glance toward Alara that fooled no one who was watching closely, her ladyship's generous initiative in the matter of the hollow ash improvements. The room applauded. Seraphina inclined her head as though the praise embarrassed her, which required, Alara thought with the detachment of a woman watching a play she already knew the ending to, a great deal more talent than anyone in that room was crediting her for. It was not an accident. It was not even strictly a lie, since Seraphina had indeed lent the fund £100 of her own money in its final week, £100 against Alara's 11 months, and had done so, Alara understood only later, expressly in order to have some technical claim to stand upon when this exact moment arrived. Everything Seraphina Vale did was built that way, a foundation of just enough truth to make the larger theft impossible to prosecute in the court of a drawing room, where the only judge was consensus and the only sentence was whispered afterward over cards. Alara sat with her hands folded in her lap and did not correct the record, because correcting it would have required saying "I did this" in a room where a woman who said such things about herself was called forward, and one who let a rival say it for her was called modest, and she had learned which of those 2 judgments cost less. It was not admiration she felt, watching Seraphina bow her head over borrowed praise. It was recognition, cold and exact, of a rule she had been taught long before she came to Alderley, that a person without inherited standing might work as hard and as cleverly as she pleased and still watch the credit walk past her on someone else's arm, because merit, in rooms like this one, was never the currency actually being spent. Lady Cressida Marsh, who had appointed herself the Assembly's unofficial mistress of tone, the way certain women appoint themselves guardians of standards no one asked them to guard, chose that moment to lean toward Alara with an expression of great solicitude. "My dear Duchess," she said, "is everything quite all right? You look almost unwell. There have been such stories this autumn about young wives finding the demands of a great house rather beyond them." The words sounded like concern. The pressure beneath them was not, and every woman within 6 feet of the exchange understood the translation perfectly, even as they pretended, with practiced faces, to hear only kindness. "I am very well, thank you, Lady Marsh," Alara answered, and let a small smile settle where a sharper woman might have let a blade show instead. "It is only warm, and I find I have very little patience left for pretending otherwise, which I understand is thought rather unbecoming in a duchess, though I confess I have never discovered who first decided so." It was not a defense. It was worse, for the moment it took Lady Marsh to realize that Alara had, in the politest possible language, accused the entire room of manufacturing rules to suit its cruelty, and by the time the realization arrived, it was too late to answer, without appearing to prove the point. A ripple of laughter went around the nearest chairs, not unkind exactly, but not entirely on Lady Marsh's side either. And it was this small, imperfect, half-earned victory that Alara carried back to her rooms that night instead of the larger defeat, because a woman learns, eventually, to feed on whatever scraps of dignity a room is willing to drop. She could have said far worse. She turned over, before sleep, the catalogue of things she might have said, that she had done the sums herself in a disguised hand, that she had walked the hollow ash lane in the rain while Seraphina Vale was ordering a green gown to match her ambitions, that £100 spent to claim 11 months of another woman's labor was not generosity, but theft wearing a fine coat. And she set each unspoken sentence down again, one by one, the way her mother had once set aside good thread rather than waste it on a seam that did. Not yet need mending. Not yet, she told herself. There would be a better moment for the truth, and she would know it when it came. It was, she was almost certain, only a private grief, invisible even to herself in daylight, that made her notice, some hours later at the same assembly, that her husband had been watching the entire exchange from across the room without once looking as though he were watching anything at all. Julian Ashford had a talent, well known and much discussed among the mothers of unmarried daughters who had once hoped to claim him, for stillness so complete it read as indifference, a face that gave away nothing because it had been trained from boyhood to consider giving anything away a kind of defeat. He stood now near the tall windows with a glass he was not drinking from, and his eyes, which Alara had catalogued in 3 years of marriage as a color somewhere between gray and the sea before a storm, had not moved from his wife's face during the whole of Lady Marsh's solicitous cruelty and Alara's quiet answer to it. He said nothing to her that night. He offered his arm at the appropriate moment, as he always did, correct as a clock, and walked her to the carriage with the same measured courtesy he extended to every social obligation, and if there was anything different in the pressure of his hand at her elbow, anything at all, Alara told herself sternly that she had imagined it, because imagining such things was a comfort she could not afford to become dependent upon. But something had shifted, in a manner too small to name and too persistent to dismiss. 3 days later, walking the East Gallery on an errand for his mother, she came upon him standing before the household ledgers with the estate's steward, Mr. Price, both men wearing the particular frown of gentlemen, confronted with arithmetic that refuses to behave. The hollow ash accounts did not balance, Price was explaining. There appeared to be a discrepancy of some £140 between what had been raised and what had been spent, and he could not for the life of him locate the error. Alara, who had drafted every figure on that page herself in Price's own disguised hand, said, before she had entirely decided to speak at all, that the discrepancy would resolve itself if one accounted for the second delivery of slate, which had been invoiced separately in error, page 41 of the tenant ledger rather than 43, where it belonged. Both men looked at her. Price, after a moment of visible astonishment, turned the pages, found the invoice exactly where she had said, and pronounced the books balanced with the relief of a man saved from an evening's tedious labor. Julian said nothing at all in that moment, but Alara, gathering her mother-in-law's summoned correspondence and preparing to withdraw, felt his gaze follow her the length of the gallery. And it was not the gaze of a man merely grateful for a lucky guess. It was the gaze, she thought afterward, lying awake and turning the small hard shape of her thimble between her fingers, of a man recalculating a sum he had believed long settled. No one saw that either, in the sense that mattered, since Price credited his own eventual thoroughness for the discovery within the hour. But Alara understood, with the particular clarity of a woman accustomed to being invisible, that she had been seen this time, actually seen, by exactly one person in that great house, and that the seeing had cost her something she could not yet name, because being noticed by a man who had promised he would never feel anything toward her was its own kind of danger. It was not admiration. Not yet. It was not even, strictly, attention in the way the word is generally used. It was recognition, the particular unwilling recognition a man gives to a fact he had assumed did not exist, and Alara had lived long enough in rooms governed by careful arithmetic to know that being recognized, in a house like Alderley, made a woman more valuable and more exposed in exactly the same breath. Lady Ophelia Ashford, Julian's younger sister, found her in the small morning room 2 days later, bent over a length of green silk that had arrived from London torn along one seam in transit, mending it herself rather than surrendering it to the lady's maid, because there is a particular peace, Alara had discovered years ago, in work that asks only competence of the hands and nothing at all of the heart. "You do that beautifully," Ophelia said, dropping into the chair opposite with the unguarded ease of a girl not yet fully hardened by the rooms she would one day be required to master. "And I don't understand why you let them all believe you can't so much as thread a needle without a maid at your elbow. It is safer to be underestimated," Alara said, not looking up from the seam. Ophelia was quiet a moment, watching her sister-in-law's hands move with the unhurried precision of long practice, and then said, in the light teasing voice she used for the truths she meant most seriously, "My brother watched you at the assembly the whole evening and thought no one noticed. And I noticed. And I think you noticed too, and I think it frightens you rather more than Lady Marsh does." Alara did not answer that directly. She tied off the thread, bit it clean with her teeth in a gesture no duchess was strictly meant to know, and said only that Ophelia read a great deal too much into the ordinary courtesy of a husband glancing occasionally at his wife. Ophelia laughed, unconvinced, kissed her cheek in the swift, affectionate manner of a girl who had decided, quite independently of her formidable mother and her guarded brother, that she loved this quiet interloper without needing anyone's permission to do so, and left the subject alone, though not before observing, from the doorway, that their mother had asked after Alara twice that week. Which was, Ophelia noted dryly, twice more than she had asked after anyone in a decade. The Dowager Duchess Augusta Ashford did not, in fact, rise when Alara entered a room, that autumn or for a long while afterward, but she had begun, in small and carefully unremarkable ways, to require her presence, summoning her to review correspondence that any competent secretary might have managed, to sit with her over the account books on wet afternoons, to render an opinion on which tenant families deserved the estate's Christmas custom this year, and which had grown too comfortable expecting it without effort. It was not warmth. Augusta Ashford had not offered warmth to anyone within Alara's observation, not even, so far as the servants' quiet consensus held, to her own children. And certainly not to a daughter-in-law purchased, as the household understood the matter without ever saying so aloud, to settle a legal difficulty rather than to be loved. But there was a difference, Alara was beginning to learn, between a woman who ignored you because you did not matter and a woman who watched you the way one watches a piece one has not yet decided whether to trust, and increasingly in the small unspoken currency of summonses and glances, and the occasional dry aphorism, dropped into a silence like a stone into a well. Augusta Ashford's attention had begun to fall into the second category rather than the first. A house that does not mend its own roof, the Dowager observed one October afternoon, apropos of nothing Alara had said aloud, generally discovers too late that the whole structure was resting upon it, and she had looked, just once, directly at her daughter-in-law when she said it, before returning her attention to the ledger, as though the remark had been nothing more than idle commentary on tenant repairs. Alara had said nothing in reply, only inclined her head, but she had gone back to her rooms that evening and sat a long while with the thimble in her palm, turning her mother's old words over beside the Dowager's new ones. A good seam mended with care holds stronger than the cloth around it. A house that does not mend its own roof discovers too late that the whole structure was resting upon it, and had begun, for the first time since her wedding day, to wonder whether she had been placed in this house not merely to solve a legal inconvenience, but to hold up, quietly and without credit. A structure that everyone else had grown too proud or too careless to notice was failing. She said this to no one. She was not yet certain enough of it to risk the saying, and there remained, in any case, the small, persistent matter of Seraphina Vale, who had taken the assembly's applause as evidence of a foothold and meant, everyone under that roof could see plainly enough, to press it. And Lady Marsh, who had not forgiven the small, unearned laughter Alara's quiet answer had won at her expense, and Aunt Honoria's letters, arriving now with a new note of urgency about a debt that a niece married so fortunately might surely see her way to settling, and beneath all of it, unspoken and unresolved, the sentence she had overheard through a half-open door 2 years before. I felt nothing when I married her, which she had folded away and not yet found the courage, or perhaps simply the occasion, to unfold again in front of the one person who had said it. She did not unfold that old sentence again that winter, though she carried it the way one carries a stone sewn into a hem, always felt, never seen. And in the weeks that followed, she learned instead to read her husband in smaller currency, a currency of glances held a fraction longer than courtesy required, of questions asked at dinner that were not, strictly, questions a man asks a wife he has promised himself not to feel anything toward. At the Fenwick card evening in November, Lady Marsh remarked, with the particular gentleness she reserved for her cruelest observations, that it must be such a relief for the Duchess to have found so practical a use for herself in the tenant accounts, since so few young wives were given useful work to occupy hands otherwise idle, and the table had laughed the soft, complicit laugh a room gives when it believes itself merely agreeing with common sense. It was not a compliment. The pressure beneath it named Alara, in one breath, both a clerk and a woman without other claims worth mentioning, and Alara had answered, setting down her cards with the same unhurried economy she used for a torn seam, that she supposed she was fortunate indeed to have found a use for hands that might otherwise have been left, like certain opinions, entirely ornamental. It was not a large victory. It won her only a ripple of laughter that was not, this time, on Lady Marsh's side, and a swift, private glance from her husband across the card table, gray eyes flickering toward her, and away again so quickly that a less practiced observer might have missed it entirely, though Alara did not, having become, by long necessity, an excellent reader of things men did not intend to be read. Julian did not defend her aloud that evening. He did something instead that she would turn over for days afterward, without quite deciding what to call it, waiting until the room had moved on to other conversation. and then remarking, in the dry, unhurried voice that carried further in a quiet room than shouting ever could, that he had always found accounts a poor test of a woman's worth, since the ones who kept them honestly rarely troubled to advertise the fact, and the ones who advertised loudest were generally keeping something else entirely. He did not look at Lady Marsh when he said it. He did not need to. The room understood the aim of the remark well enough that Lady Marsh's smile thinned by exactly the degree required to prove the arrow had landed, and Alara, watching her husband return his attention to his cards as though he had said nothing more remarkable than a comment on the weather, felt something small and unfamiliar move through her chest, not gratitude exactly, not yet anything so simple as hope, but the beginning of a private arithmetic of her own. A slow tally of moments in which a man who had promised to feel nothing kept, against his own stated intention, behaving as though he felt something after all. It was not admiration. It was not yet, anything she allowed herself to name outright. But it was recognition of a kind, and recognition, once begun, has a way of accumulating interest whether or not either party intends to collect it. There followed, across the turning of that winter, a slow accretion of such moments, each too small to constitute an event, and each, together, forming something that could no longer honestly be called nothing. He sought her out in the estate office on a wet Tuesday to ask her opinion on a tenant dispute over a boundary hedge, a matter he could easily have settled with price alone, and stood listening to her reasoning with a stillness that was not, she began to understand, the stillness of a man merely being patient. He remarked, once, over breakfast, apropos of nothing she had said, that his mother had grown almost talkative since the autumn, an observation delivered with the particular dryness that passed, in him, for warmth, and left unspoken the plain fact that his mother had grown talkative specifically in Alara's company, and no one else's. He crossed a crowded room at the Ashworth musical evening in December, when Serafina Vele had contrived, with the effortless cruelty of a woman who mistook charm for kindness, to seat herself at the pianoforte directly opposite Alara and dedicate her performance, with a look calculated to be read by every woman present, to those who found themselves, this season, rather less accomplished than they had hoped to be, and instead of allowing the moment its intended sting, Julian had crossed the room, taken the chair beside his wife, and remained there for the length of the performance without once glancing toward the instrument, a piece of blocking so plain in its meaning that even Lady Marsh, watching from her customary vantage near the fire, had gone very still. Beside me, not before me, Alara thought, feeling the particular warmth of his shoulder near hers through the cold silk of her sleeve, and did not trust the thought enough to keep it, folding it away instead with all the others she was not yet ready to unfold. Not admiration, not yet, but something with the shape of it, waiting. It was the aphorism her mother had left her that returned to her most often that winter, turning it now the way she had once turned the thimble itself, looking for the light to catch it differently. A good seam, mended with care, holds stronger than the cloth around it. She had understood it, for years, as a comfort offered to a girl who had been torn by grief, a promise that what breaks can be made whole again. She had begun to understand it now, watching her husband's slow and reluctant unbending toward her, as something closer to a warning, that mending required both parties to hold still long enough for the needle to do its work, and that a marriage contracted in one careless afternoon by lawyers settling an entailment might yet, given enough patient stitching, become something neither of them had bargained for at the altar. It was this fragile, half-admitted hope, still unspoken even to herself in any words she would have owned aloud, that made the letter, when it came, land with such particular violence. It arrived on a morning in late January, brought up with the Dowager's private correspondence by a footman who noticed nothing remarkable about it beyond the absence of a return direction, a plain sealed sheet addressed in a hand disguised just enough to defeat casual recognition, and not quite enough, though no one understood this yet, to defeat close examination. Augusta Ashford read it standing at her writing table, and Alara, summoned 20 minutes later to the small parlor where the Dowager conducted business too delicate for the drawing room, understood before a single word was spoken that something had shifted in the house's weather, because Augusta Ashford, who had not risen for anyone in 30 years, was standing when Alara entered. Upright and rigid as a woman bracing against a wind not yet arrived. Julian had been sent for as well, and came in a moment later still in his riding coat, snow melting unheeded on his shoulders, his face already schooled into the particular blankness he wore when he expected trouble and had not yet decided how to meet it. "Read it yourself," Augusta said, and there was no cruelty in her voice, only the flat, exhausted directness of a woman who had already decided what she believed and required only the formality of hearing it confirmed. The letter, unsigned, addressed to the Dowager Duchess as one lady of standing to another, expressed its author's profound and reluctant distress at a matter too delicate to leave unspoken, namely that the Ashford betrothal sapphire, the ring given to every duchess of that house upon her marriage and worn, by long custom, at every formal occasion, had been quietly pawned some 6 weeks previous at a broker's shop off Carrow Lane. A disreputable quarter-know lady of standing ought to know existed, let alone visit, the proceeds, some £80, matching with troubling exactness a sum lately and urgently requested by a certain impecunious aunt in the country. Enclosed, folded twice, was a broker's ticket bearing a description of the ring, a date, and a signature purporting to be Alara's own. The writer regretted, with an unctuousness that made the cruelty of the thing almost admirable in its construction, that copies of this distressing intelligence had, out of an excess of concern for the family's good name, already reached 1 or 2 other households of consequence, in the hope that the matter might be quietly resolved before it became the subject of unkinder speculation than the writer herself intended. It was, Alara thought, reading it through once and then again, with the strange calm of a woman standing at the center of her own catastrophe, a document built with real craft, true in its smaller particulars, in the exact figure of her aunt's demands, in the well-known custom of the ring, false only in the one essential fact it hung everything upon, and it was that single false fact she reached for now, the way her mother had once reached for a dropped stitch, calmly, without panic, because panic mends nothing, and a steady hand mends everything. "I have never been to Carrow Lane in my life," she said, and heard her own voice come out level, though her pulse was not level at all beneath the plain gray wool of her bodice. "I do not know where it is. I have never pawned the ring, and I have never signed my name to any such paper." It was not a plea. She did not raise her voice, and she did not weep, and she watched her husband's face while she said it, hunting for some flicker of belief or doubt beneath that carefully unreadable stillness, and found nothing at all, which frightened her far more than open suspicion would have done, because a man who doubted openly could at least be argued with, while a man who gave away nothing might be believing anything behind that closed door of a face, or nothing, and she had no way to know which. It was Augusta who spoke first, and what she said would return to Alara many times in the months afterward, though at that moment it landed simply as rescue. "I did not raise a fool for a son, nor choose a fool for a daughter," she said, "and I have watched this girl mend a torn hedge dispute, a leaking roof, and my own son's ledgers with the same 2 hands, and I have never once seen her reach for a lie when the truth would serve, whereas I have watched a great many ladies of this county reach for exactly that." And I know the difference between them well enough after 60 years to trust my own eyes over an unsigned letter written by a coward too frightened to put her name to her own accusation. It was not proof. It was, Alara understood even in the depth of her own fear, something rarer and in its way more valuable than proof, the plain, unearned gift of belief offered before evidence, offered simply because a woman had watched another woman's hands long enough to trust what they built, and she felt something crack loose in her chest at the receiving of it, something she had been holding shut for 3 years against exactly this kind of catastrophe, and did not, quite, let herself cry, because there would be time enough for that later, and there was work to do first. Then, let us find the proof to answer it properly, Augusta said, turning the ticket over in her hands with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had spent decades separating true grievances from manufactured ones. And let us begin with the date, since dates, unlike character, may be checked. The ticket named a date some 6 weeks past, a Thursday in the second week of December, and Alara, closing her eyes for a moment to summon the shape of that particular week, said slowly that the second Thursday of December was the day she had ridden out to Hollow Ash with Mr. Price to inspect the new well before the ground froze too hard for digging, a full day's excursion. 3 tenant families and the steward himself present as witnesses from morning until well past dark. And that she had not, in fact, so much as set foot off the estate that entire day, let alone traveled the 11 miles to town and back to visit a broker's shop she could not have named if her life depended upon it. Price was sent for within the half hour, and confirmed the matter from his own pocket ledger without hesitation. The date, the hour of departure, the hour of return, the names of the 3 tenant families who could, if required, swear to the same. And there it is, Augusta said quietly, laying the broker's ticket flat upon the table beside the steward's ledger, as though setting 2 scales to balance against each other. A woman cannot be in 2 places at once. Whatever else this letter would have us believe. And a lie that requires the impossible has already confessed itself. But the discovery, satisfying as it was, wanted one further stroke to close the matter entirely. And it was Julian, breaking his long silence at last, who supplied it, taking the ticket from his mother's hand and studying the signature at its foot with the narrow, unhurried attention Alara had watched him bring to disputed boundary lines, and nothing else quite so closely until that moment. "This slants wrong," he said. "My wife writes with her left hand, badly disguised as her right for the sake of appearances at the desk downstairs, and any clerk who has watched her sign the household accounts would know the particular backward lean of it, whereas this signature slants forward, cleanly, the way a right-handed clerk writes when asked to imitate a hand he has never actually observed closely." It was the first time he had called her my wife in a sentence that carried any warmth at all, and Alara heard it the way one hears a single true note struck cleanly after an evening of discord, though she gave herself no leave to dwell on it yet, because there remained the ring itself to produce, and this she did herself, sending her maid for the small locked box where the Ashford sapphire had rested, untouched and unworn since her wedding day, since she had never felt it suited her plain habits and had kept it instead as a piece of ceremony brought out only for the largest occasions. The box was fetched, unlocked, opened upon the table before all 3 of them, and there, exactly where it had always lain, wrapped in the same faded velvet cloth, sat the ring itself, its dark stone catching the gray winter light through the parlor window without the smallest sign of ever having left that box at all. "There it is," Alara said, echoing the dowager's own words without meaning to, and heard, in the small silence that followed, the particular quality of a room recalibrating itself around a fact it could no longer avoid. No one asked, in that room, who had written the letter, though every one of them, Alara suspected, had already arrived privately at the same short list of names, a list that began with a woman in a green gown who had once claimed 11 months of another woman's labor with a single well-timed £100, and did not end far from her, since Lady Marsh's particular gift for delivering cruelty dressed as concern would have made her the natural hand to draft such a letter, even if she had not held the pen herself. Augusta said only that she would attend to the matter of who had circulated such falsehoods among her acquaintance in her own time and her own manner, and the flat, unhurried menace in the way she said it suggested that whoever had written that letter would come, before the season was out, to regret the paper it had been written on. Though for now, she said. Folding the offending sheet and the false ticket together with the brisk finality of a woman closing a ledger, the household had a storm coming in from the west by the look of the sky, and there were more pressing matters than chasing a coward through the drawing rooms of the county before nightfall. It was true. The light through the parlor window had gone the particular flat, bruised gray that Alara had learned, in 3 winters at Alderley, to read as warning. And by the time the small party dispersed, Augusta to write letters of her own, Price to see the outbuildings secured, Alara found herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily reckon, entirely alone with her husband in a room from which everyone else had quietly, and, she suspected, deliberately withdrawn. He did not speak at once. He stood by the window with the folded letter still in his hand, turning it over as though it might yield some further confession if examined long enough, and when he did speak, his voice had lost the flat courtroom precision it had carried through the whole ordeal, roughened instead into something closer to the voice of a man rather than a duke settling an account. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. "When the letter was first read aloud, I said nothing, and you looked at me waiting for something, and I gave you nothing, and I have been standing here since trying to decide whether that was caution or cowardice, and I find I do not care for either answer." It was not an apology exactly, not the kind offered easily by men accustomed to being obeyed rather than forgiven, but Alara heard beneath it something she had not expected to hear from him in that particular hour, an admission that her fear in that room had mattered to him, that his silence had cost him something even as it had cost her more, and she found she did not have a ready answer for it. Only the strange loosened feeling of a knot finally given enough slack to breathe around. "You believed me," she said carefully, watching his face for the answer rather than trusting whatever he might choose to say aloud. "I never doubted you," he said, and the plainness of it, delivered without ornament, without the careful irony he wore like armor in every drawing room in the county, struck her harder than any more elaborate declaration could have done. "I doubted myself. I have spent 3 years telling myself and everyone within hearing that I felt nothing in this marriage beyond the settling of an old debt, and I stood in that room today and understood, watching you defend yourself with more grace than I have managed to muster in 30 years of practice at it, that I have been lying to my mother and to you, and worst of all, to myself, for rather longer than I care to admit, and I do not yet know what to do with that admission, only that I could not go on pretending I had not made it." The wind had begun to rise outside, rattling the old glass in its frame, and somewhere below in the yard a groom was shouting for the stable doors to be secured before the weather worsened, and Alara stood very still in the gathering dark of that small parlor with her husband's unfinished confession hanging unclaimed in the air between them. Neither of them quite ready yet to reach for it. And it was into that suspended, storm-charged silence that a servant came at last to say that supper was delayed on account of the weather, and that her ladyship the Dowager had asked that everyone keep early hours that night, since by all report, the storm coming off the western hills meant to be a considerable one before it had finished with them. The storm broke in earnest a little before midnight, rain driving hard enough against the old glass that the whole house seemed to shudder with each gust, and Ilara, unable to settle to sleep with the unfinished sentence her husband had left hanging in the parlor, still turning over and over in her chest, had gone down at last to the library rather than lie awake counting the minutes by the striking of the hall clock. She did not light more than a single branch of candles. She sat instead in the deep window seat with her mother's thimble held loosely in her palm, watching the lightning lay itself briefly and violently across the black lawn. And it was there, a little before 2 by the clock on the mantel, that she heard the door open behind her and did not need to turn to know who had come. He did not speak at once. He crossed the room the way a man crosses ground he has walked 1,000 times, and now finds, unaccountably, unfamiliar, 3 measured steps, and then a pause, as though some old habit of caution still argued against the 4th, and Ilara, watching his reflection gather itself in the dark window glass, thought that she had never once, in 3 years of marriage, seen Julian Ashford move without absolute certainty of where he meant to arrive. "I did not come to finish an apology," he said at last, still some 6 feet from her, his voice stripped of the dry courtroom precision it wore in every drawing room in the county, and stripped, too, she noticed, of the particular flatness he used when he wished a thing to sound settled rather than felt. "I have never been especially good at those, and you deserve better than a man practicing contrition like a speech memorized for the house. I came because I have spent 3 hours turning a great many false reasons over in my hands, the way you turn that thimble of yours, looking for the one that would hold, and I find that none of the easy ones will do any longer. I did not marry you because the entailment required a quiet, convenient wife who would ask no questions and expect no affection in return, though God knows that was the reason I gave myself the morning of our wedding, and I have discovered it will not bear the weight I once asked it to carry. I did not learn to watch for you across a crowded room because my mother has grown fond of you, though she has, more fond, I think, than she has been of anyone in 30 years, and that alone should have told me something I was too proud to hear. I did not cross that parlor floor to stand beside you at Ophelia's musical evening because propriety demanded a husband defend his wife from a rival's unkindness, though propriety would have served as a perfectly respectable excuse, and I let it serve as one, to myself, for far longer than I am comfortable admitting. Every one of those was a door I built to avoid the room behind it, and tonight, watching you defend your own name in that parlor, with more grace than I have managed in a lifetime of practice at seeming unshaken, the last of those doors came off its hinges, and I found there was only one true thing left standing behind them all, which is that I have discovered, somewhere in these 3 years I told myself did not touch me, that I do not wish to come home to a quiet house any longer unless you are the one keeping it. And I find that I watch for you now, not because anyone requires it of me. Not my mother, not the county, not the ledger, but because when no one at all is watching, when there is no audience to perform correctness for, I have found that I am watching you anyway, and I have come to understand that I do not wish to stop. He had crossed the last of the distance while he spoke, so that by the time the final sentence left him he stood close enough that she could hear the unsteady catch beneath his otherwise even voice. A man who had spent his whole life being listened to and had never before, she suspected, actually needed to be believed. She did not go to him at once. She sat very still in the window seat, with the storm working itself out against the glass behind her, and she let herself remember, deliberately, and without flinching from it, the particular cold weight of the sentence she had carried, folded inside her for 2 years, I felt nothing when I married her, and I expect to feel nothing further, and she found that she owed herself, if nothing else, the plain dignity of saying it aloud before she allowed either of them the comfort of moving past it. You said, 2 years ago, through a door you did not know I stood behind, that you felt nothing when you married me, and that you expected to feel nothing further, she said, and her voice did not shake, though something in her chest had gone tight and hot at the saying of it. I have carried that sentence a long while, Julian. I do not intend to set it down simply because you have found a prettier one to replace it with tonight. There was a small, unguarded flinch at that, the first true crack she had ever seen open in the careful composure he wore like a second coat, and he did not try to argue the memory away from her, which she noted, privately, as the first evidence that whatever stood before her now was not merely a performance calculated to win an easier peace. I said it, he answered. I said it because it was easier to believe than the alternative, which was that I had married a stranger for a lawyer's convenience and had no right whatsoever to expect her to become anything more to me than that, and admitting otherwise felt. At the time, like admitting I had done you a considerable wrong in marrying you at all, without asking whether you wished it. I cannot unsay it. I can only tell you that the man who said it did not yet know you, and the man standing here tonight does, and I would rather stand here and be measured honestly against that old cruelty than have you forgive it before you have decided I have earned the forgiving. It was, she thought, exactly the right thing to say, not because it undid the old wound, but because it did not attempt to, and she felt the last of her withheld resistance loosen by a fraction, though she did not yet let it go entirely, because a woman who surrenders the whole of her guarded ground at the first fine sentence has learned nothing at all from 3 years of careful mending. I am not the girl your mother's lawyers purchased to settle an entailment, she said. I will not be handed back into that bargain now, simply because you have found, at your convenience, that the bargain has grown sentimental. If you want a wife, Julian, you will have to want the whole of her, the one who disguises her hand in the ledgers, and the one who mends her own hymns, rather than ring for a maid, and the one who has spent 3 years learning to survive rooms that would rather she did not exist at all, and you will have to say so plainly, not in doors you build and dismantle as it suits you, but once, entirely, without a door left standing behind it. He was quiet a long moment, and outside the storm cracked once, hard, close enough that the candle flame guttered sideways before steadying, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost even the last thin membrane of formality it had carried into the room. Not because the entailment required it, he said, not because my mother wishes it, though she does, and not because the county has already decided in its own gossiping arithmetic that we suit each other rather better than either of us has admitted aloud. I want you, Alara, because you are the only person in this house, or any other, who has never once performed for me, who corrected my steward's arithmetic without asking to be thanked for it, who answered Cressida Marsh's cruelty with more dignity than I have managed answering my own mother, and because I have discovered that the ordinary unwatched hours of my day, the ones no one else troubles to notice, have become the hours I want you in most of all. That is the whole of it. That is the only true reason left standing, and I offer it to you not as a settlement, but as a question, because I find I would rather be refused honestly than accepted out of habit. Yes, she said, and let the word rest a moment before she gave him the rest of it, because I wish it, and heard, in the small unsteady breath he let out at that, the sound of a man who had genuinely not known, until that instant, which answer he would receive. She did not fling herself into his arms, not at first, holding instead to the last quiet reserve of a woman who has earned the right to be asked properly before she is claimed. But when he reached for her hand across the narrowing distance between the window seat and where he stood, she let him take it, and he did not let it go again, not when she rose. Not when the storm cracked a third time somewhere over the western hills, not when the tears she had been holding back through 3 years of careful composure finally rose and spilled, quietly, without the smallest hint of collapse in them, because they were not grief breaking her open, but simply truth. Arriving late and unannounced, finding its own way at last to the surface. He did not tell her to stop crying. He stood with her hand held fast in his and let her weep the plain, dignified tears of a woman who has been proven right about something she was never permitted to say aloud, and when at last she quieted, he lifted her hand, thimble and all, and pressed his mouth briefly to her knuckles in a gesture that asked nothing further of her than what she had already given. Let them talk, she thought, feeling the old bitter accounting of who had watched her fall settle, for the first time, into something almost like peace. Let the whole county remember exactly how few of them stood near enough to see this part, since it was never the falling that mattered, only who remained to witness the mending. The storm broke fully before dawn, spending itself out over the hills in one long final roll of thunder before the sky began, reluctantly, to gray, and by the time the household woke to a washed, dripping, curiously gentle morning, something in Alderley House had shifted that no servant could have named precisely, but every one of them felt. The particular loosened quality of a house no longer holding its breath. It was the following spring, the willows along the hollow ash lane just beginning to green, when the well and the re-roofed cottages that had been Alara's quiet unclaimed labor 2 years before were joined at last by the second, larger project she had spent that whole winter and spring building in patient secrecy. A plain stone workroom at the edge of the home farm, where the estate's poorer women, the widows and unmarried daughters and the wives of tenants too proud to beg outright, might learn fine needlework and mending to a standard that could be sold, honestly and at a fair price, to the great houses of the county, who had always been willing enough to pay for good work so long as they never had to see. Whose hands had done it. She had named it, over Julian's mild protest that duchesses did not typically attach their own names to charitable enterprises, simply the Mending House, and had opened it that spring with no ceremony beyond a plain announcement in the parish, expecting nothing more than quiet, useful work continuing as it always had, invisible and unthanked. It did not stay invisible. Word traveled, as good work eventually does, even in a county that prefers its gossip cruel to its praise generous, that the Duke's own Duchess had learned her trade from a seamstress mother, and had never once been ashamed to say so, and the same women who had once murmured the word practical across card tables with knives folded inside it began, by slow and grudging degrees, to use it without the knives until practical became, in Alderley's drawing rooms that year, very nearly a compliment. Lady Seraphina Vale did not weather the season as well. The forged letter, though never proven in any court that would have made a public spectacle of it, had left enough of a trail in stationery and hand and motive that Augusta Ashford, true to her quiet promise, had seen to it that the truth reached exactly the ears it needed to reach without ever once needing to be shouted, and Seraphina found, by midsummer, that the invitations which had once arrived by the dozen had thinned to a handful, and that the £100 she had once spent so cleverly to claim another woman's labor had bought her, in the end, considerably less credit than she had bargained for. She removed, eventually, to a cousin's house in a county where her history had not yet caught up with her, and the Alderley drawing rooms, Alara noticed without any particular satisfaction in the noticing, seemed to breathe rather more easily without her in them. Lady Cressida Marsh remained, as such women generally do, but her particular gift for solicitous cruelty found fewer and fewer rooms willing to laugh along with it, and she settled, in time, into the smaller, quieter tyranny of a woman whose opinions no longer moved a table the way they once had. Aunt Honoria's letters continued to arrive with their old regularity, though Alara answered them now from a position sturdy enough that she could decline, with perfect courtesy and no explanation owed, the requests that had once frightened her into silence, and found, to her mild surprise, that her aunt's affection, thin as it had always been, survived the refusal well enough, since it had never truly required her gratitude so much as her compliance. It was at the harvest fete that autumn, held on the home farm green with the mending house standing finished and full behind it, its windows bright with lamplight and its doorway hung with the first bolts of cloth the women there had sold at a fair London price, that the whole slow architecture of that year came, at last, to its public reckoning. The green was crowded, tenants and tradesmen, and half the county's lesser gentry mingling in the loose, unguarded way such gatherings allow, and Augusta Ashford had been brought out in her chair to the shaded edge of the green, as she always was on such occasions, to receive the county's respects without the trouble of standing through an entire afternoon's greetings. A habit so old and so absolute that no one under that sky had ever thought to question it, not in 30 years. The murmur that ran through the crowd when Alara came at last across the green, having spent the better part of the morning inside teaching a girl of 12 the proper tension for a hemming stitch, was not, at first, remarkable. Only the ordinary ripple of attention any duchess draws crossing an open lawn. What silenced it, what turned every head on that green at once and held them there, was the sight of the Dowager Duchess of Alderley rising from her chair. She rose slowly, with the deliberate, unhurried dignity of a woman who has never in her life done anything she did not fully intend, and she stood, upright as a closed door finally opened, while her daughter-in-law crossed the last of the grass toward her, and the whole green, tenants and gentry and the county's oldest gossips alike, went very quiet indeed, because every one of them understood, without needing to be told, that they were watching something happen that had not happened in 30 years, and that it was happening now. In full daylight, for a woman most of them had once dismissed with a single practical word. Julian, standing near the makeshift platform that had been raised for the day's speeches, saw his mother rise and understood, before anyone spoke a word of explanation, that the moment required him to speak as well, and he climbed the platform steps and raised his hand for quiet that the green had already, in its stunned way, given him. They called her practical, he said, and his voice, pitched to carry across the whole green without ever once rising into a shout, held the particular quiet authority of a man who has finally stopped pretending indifference to what he says. I confess I let them, for a while, because it was easier than admitting what I had actually married, which was not a convenient arrangement, but a woman of uncommon competence, uncommon patience, and uncommon grace under a cruelty that would have broken a lesser spirit twice over before breakfast. They were wrong about her. All of us were wrong about her. Wrong to call her practical as though it were a small thing, when I have come to understand that practical, in her hands, has only ever meant love that does not wait to be thanked before it does its work. She mended a roof no one asked her to mend. She mended a household's books without once claiming the credit, and she has mended, this past year, this house itself, myself included, though I dare say I was rather more stubborn about the tearing than any roof at Hollow Ash. A ripple of honest laughter went through the crowd at that, warm rather than cutting, and Julian let it settle before he went on, his eyes finding Alara's across the green and holding there. Whatever this county believed of her when she came among us, whatever careless word we let stand in place of her true worth, let it be known plainly today that the word was wrong, and that I, for one, mean to spend whatever years I have left proving it wrong in front of every soul who ever doubted her. So that when my own children ask what kind of woman their mother is, the answer they receive from every mouth in this county will already be settled, and settled true. The applause that broke over the green then was not the thin, negotiated laughter a clever barb earns at a card table, but something whole and unguarded, tenants and gentry alike clapping with the particular relief of people, finally permitted to admit aloud what some of them, quietly, had suspected all along, and Augusta Ashford, still standing amid the noise with her hand resting on Alara's arm, said only, in the dry, unsentimental voice she had used for every true thing she had ever spoken, that she supposed 30 years was long enough to wait for a reason worth standing for, and that she did not intend, having finally found one, to sit through the remainder of her life pretending she had not noticed it. Alara did not answer that with words. She reached instead for the thimble she still carried, worn thinner now than the day her mother had pressed it into her palm, and closed her hand around it for a long moment before letting Julian take her other hand in his, in front of the whole green, in front of every doubting mouth that had ever called her practical, as though it were an insult rather than the truest word anyone had ever used for her. And she found, standing there with her mother-in-law upright beside her for the first time in 30 years, and her husband's hand warm and unhesitating in her own, that she had, at last, nothing left to prove, and nothing left to withhold, only a great deal, quite suddenly, to be grateful for. It was not a perfect ending, and no honest accounting of it would have called it one. There remained tenant disputes to settle and ledgers to balance, and, somewhere in a distant county, a woman in a green gown, nursing a grievance that would likely never entirely cool, and Lady Marsh's tongue would sharpen itself on some fresh target before the year was out, because a county does not become kind merely because one of its cruelties has been answered. But it was, Alara thought, watching the last of that autumn light gild the mending house windows, and the green fill with the ordinary, unglamorous joy of tenants sharing cider and children chasing each other between the stalls, enough, in the way her mother had always meant the word to be understood, not a triumph so complete it left nothing further to mend, but a life stitched together with care by two people who had each, in their own stubborn way, learned that a seam mended honestly holds stronger than the cloth around it. She had always been worth believing in. It had simply taken the people around her considerably longer than it should have to learn how to look. That winter passed gently, the mending house full through the coldest months, with women glad of the warm room and the steady wage, and when spring came again to Alderley, the storms of the previous year already softened in memory into the kind of story a house tells about itself, the kind that grows kinder each time it is repeated. Alara stood once more at the same library window where she had sat waiting out the thunder. A year before, watching the last gray edge of an ordinary night rain give way, as it always eventually does, to a clean and unremarkable dawn. Julian came to stand behind her, his hand finding hers without either of them needing to reach very far for it any longer, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, because there was, by then, very little left that needed saying aloud. It was not perfect. It was not, most days, even particularly easy, since two stubborn people rarely make an easy household of it. It was simply shared, at last, in the plain, unremarkable morning light, two hands joined and neither one letting go. And that, Alara thought, watching the sun finally clear the wet black line of the hills, was very much more than enough.